keep working at TV, which is always the tricky part.
Yeah, it says it's streaming live on Facebook.
Thank God. Woo.
You're smiling.
It's working.
It's working.
Hey.
Thank God. Okay. Good Lord, I've never been so anxious. Okay, I'm going to post that we are live.
Okay.
People are seeing. Okay, so welcome to people who are joining. My apologies. I'll give folks some time to get on. Ah, there we go. Hello, I'm seeing a bunch of my regular Bible study folks are here. Welcome. I'm going to post the link everywhere. My apologies for my technical difficulties. And thank you for your grace over here, pastors. Okay, I posted the link everywhere. All right. So I'm seeing a bunch of folks from my church. It looks like maybe we've got some other folks who might join as well. But we are finally live. So here we are to talk about racism in a holy and sacred way. So I'm going to start with introductions. And at first, for anybody who might attend, and I see we have a few who are not from Zion, I am Pastor Elizabeth Duffy. I'm the pastor of Zion United Church of Christ in Tonawanda, New York, just outside of Buffalo. And I have with me the Reverend Dr. Marsha Williams. And Reverend Dr. Marsha Williams is the Associate Conference Minister of the New York Conference, which happens to be my conference. And she is very capable of talking about this topic. I know that she leads programs in churches. And so I'm so thankful that Reverend Dr. Marsha Williams is here. And then we also have from St. Lawrence University, we have the Reverend Dr. Shaun Whitehead, who just so happened to have been my college chaplain. And listening to her sermon one day made me think, hey, that would be so wonderful to have Reverend Whitehead be here as well to speak in this conversation. So I know we've got a bunch of people joining us right now. And so we are so thankful that all of you are here. While I gave a brief introduction about these two fabulous pastors that I would love to tell you even more about, I would like to give them a moment to talk about themselves, to give some introductions about who they are, where they're from, and the work that they do. So, Reverend Dr. Marsha Williams, why don't we begin with you?
Okay. I am the Associate Conference Minister for Authorized Ministry Concerns in the New York Conference of the United Church of Christ. And so a lot of what I deal with, in addition to search and call for our churches across the state, a lot of what I deal with are things related to authorized ministry concerns. So I serve all the ministers of the New York Conference. I have been in pastoral ministry for close to almost 30 years now, coming up on 30 years in pastoral ministry. I've served churches in Indiana and also in Washington State. And I do also lead the racism work, our New and Right Spirit program, which is our racism work here in the New York Conference. And I'm just happy to be here with you, Elizabeth. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. and Reverend Dr. Shaun Whitehead. Will you please introduce yourself?
Yes. So Shaun Whitehead, I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I came to the North Country, to St. Lawrence University in 2003. I like to tell people with a one-year contract, tell me God is not wild, right? And the real gift is that St. Lawrence has indeed made a way for me to walk into ministry in amazing ways. I was ordained here in this region. I was ordained in the United Church of Christ. And so Marsha is my associate conference minister. And so I'm a part of the New Year Conference, Black River St. Lawrence Association of the United Church of Christ. And I am the newly appointed university chaplain at St. Lawrence. I've been the associate chaplain throughout the years. And we just lost our university chaplain, Reverend Kathleen Buckley, who's also my partner and spouse, in January to pancreatic cancer. And so we journeyed together in ministry in amazing ways. And so been able to be in ministry here in academe, which is amazing work that it wasn't even on the radar. So it wasn't anything I said no to. It wasn't even on the radar. And so I'm grateful for the ways in which God has allowed me to walk in ministry in this way. Born and raised on the South Side of Chicago in the Black church tradition. And so I've been able to kind of journey in many different worlds with the tradition that birthed me and continues to birth me in this way. So I'm just grateful to be here. It's wonderful to see you in this space, Elizabeth.
Oh, wonderful. Now, I will give some introductions about myself. So as I mentioned, I'm the pastor at Zion United Church of Christ. I have been the pastor here for 10 years. Not sure how that happened. How 10 years so quickly went by. But the reason why I find it so interesting to have these conversations in this great and deep and open way and in a sacred way is because I am clearly a person who is not African American. I have white skin, and I grew up in a completely white town. And so I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and there was no diversity at all really in my town, even though it's just one town over from a college town. There I had the only diversity that I had in my entire class, all the way from kindergarten all the way through to graduating high school. The only diversity that I had in my class at all was, I do remember in elementary school that I did have one friend who was Puerto Rican who was in my class. And then I had one other classmate all the way from kindergarten to 12th grade who was Korean. That was it for diversity. So the idea of talking about any sort of diversity or really having any idea about racism, it wasn't anything that came up because it wasn't something that I understood. Thankfully, I did have parents that did talk to me about this. And I grew up in Massachusetts, so we kind of thought that racism was just a Southern thing. We didn't think that it actually really existed anymore. We thought that it pretty much, at least those who were raised, I think, along with me, we thought that racism was really something that stayed down in the South and only existed in the South. We didn't think that it really existed in the North at all. This was my naivete because I had no experience really with people of color. Thankfully, my mother was very into making sure that I understood that racism did still exist, even though I had never seen it. I would see that some people in my small town would sometimes make racist jokes, or at one time, my mother will tell the story about when I was in middle school and I went to a friend's house and her mother made a racist joke. And I right away picked up the phone and called my mother and said, I need you to come get me. I don't feel comfortable. So she had given me enough of that experience, but I still never knew how to talk about it. And in all honesty, it wasn't until I got to seminary and had friends who were pastors, who were people of color, who started to tell me their experiences and tell me their stories that allowed me to see, wow, like we still have a long ways to go in this country. And so I don't think we're going to come up with any magic answers in this conversation that we're having today. But my hope is that by telling stories and sharing stories, we can help. Maybe there's some people like me who grew up with such little diversity that they didn't think it was a problem anymore. Maybe people like me can have their eyes opened, and maybe the rest of us can just listen and learn, which I've learned that to listen in order to learn instead of listening to speak has helped me grow a lot as an individual and as a pastor. So that's my thoughts. That's why I've asked you to gather here. And I'm so thankful that the two pastors that I asked were willing to say yes and to join with me. And so before we begin with anything, I just want to take a moment to check in with the status of everything going on in the world, coronavirus, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of the deaths that we've witnessed on TV, which has been a huge shock, I think, to much of the world, how the two of you are doing. So first, let's start with Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, how are you doing? How's your soul? How's your spirit right now?
Well, in light of everything that's been going on, I guess I'm doing okay. I can't admit that, just like most people of color, there is a sense of exhaustion that always seems to sometimes rise to the surface in times of situations like this. But I know for myself, I took a day where I didn't want to talk about it, and I kind of gave myself a break from the news and so forth. I took a minute to lament and to regroup, and after doing so, I sort of got my second wind, if you will, and it made me all the more committed to addressing racism, and particularly addressing racism in the church, and even then here in the New York conference. So in light of that, I'm doing okay.
Thank you. Dr. Whitehead.
I concur with the exhaustion. The things that have happened, I have lost, like me, if we have not lost someone directly, I think we're just one person removed from it, right? We know of someone who knows someone. In terms of COVID-19, being from the South Side of Chicago, we've heard about the number of deaths, along with just the number of folk afflicted with the coronavirus, the novel virus. And that has indeed hit my community hard. And then when I get calls from my father about persons we know, up close and personal folk that we know who have succumbed, obviously it is devastating, and not being able to gather in the ways that we are accustomed to gathering in our sorrow, there is no traveling, and some folk who have had to suffer in that way in isolation. And so the lament has been heavy and needed, right? We've needed the room to lament what has happened during this time, but also in terms of the racialized violence that we have witnessed. There is a pummeling of the spirit that happens in that. So yeah, it's enough to send one to one's bed, because the thing is, there's not always an outlet to wail, to weep and wail, and then yes, people do wonder what you think about us. The things that have happened. And so sometimes, being a person of color, eyes are on you, whether you know it or not. Folk want to know how you feel about things. And some folk want you to speak, and other folk don't want you to speak as much. And so recognizing that all of these things are at play. And I think that many of us, we hold intention, we hold all of these realities, right? And so, yes, it's been, but at the same time, I'm here. Right. I recognize my own blessings of being able to basically shelter in place in peace. And I recognize the many different ways that folk have not been able to be in peace or at peace during this time, for many different reasons. And so, but I'm here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to gather in this way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, there's one more thing that I did want to mention, that as I did the introductions of Reverend Dr. Shaun Whitehead, that when I grew up, I always went to either an Episcopalian or United Church of Christ church. And that was it. I don't think I ever paid attention to an actual sermon. And then I went to college, and Dr. Whitehead started in 2003. So that would have been my sophomore year, or maybe freshman year, depending on when exactly you started. And for the first time, I heard somebody preach, and I understood every word, and it moved me, and it moved me to praise and to witness the way that you, which I know your tradition feeds into, the tradition that you are raised in, to witness your leadership and worship. inspired me more than I think I could ever say. And
Absolutely.
so I think that you, even though you were ordained in the United Church of Christ, that you brought your Black church experience with you.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
And to say it's a gift, and the way that you bring your spirit and the spirit into it, it's just amazing. And
Bless
so I just need to say that as I'm doing these
you.
introductions. You helped me to truly fall in love in church. I fall in love with church.
Amen.
Uh,
Amen.
I had always loved church, but it was a whole different experience once I went to St. Lawrence.
Amen.
And that's thanks to you, and thanks to Kathleen Buckley.
Yes.
You too. Amazing.
God bless you.
So just to make you blush a little.
Yeah. Check it in the mail.
Okay, so now I am going to jump right in. So I think that the best way to have these conversations about racism in general is to hear stories. Because as I said, growing up, I thought that there were some people who maybe said some racist things and that was on them. I thought that they were the ones who I just had some problems, but there weren't that many of them. And so when I started talking to my Black friends in seminary and they told me their stories, I quickly realized that every person of color had these stories. So these stories, I'll give you some examples. One friend who was traveling down south, he had one parent who's white and the other parent who's Black. And he was traveling down south, and his family was explaining to him, he was just a boy, that they were going to go through a town that was not safe for people of color. And so he had to hide. And that to me, thinking he was just a boy at that time, and he was from Massachusetts, so he was not used to that much overt racism. But to go through that, and he was probably the age of my daughter, about 8 years old, and it really shook him to his core. So that was the one story that he said was his first real strong experience. I don't know if you want to share any stories. If you feel open to, definitely do not if you do not want to. But if you have any stories that you would like to share, and it's entirely up to you, please feel free.
Well, I've had, it's like hard, it's like trying to think of just one incident. But I can recall a church that I was serving. It was a small white church, and they called me to be their pastor. One of the reasons why I stood out, I guess, in the interview was because I was a musician, and this church wanted to change their music in their music program. And so in serving them, as we began to do some of that, begin to change some of the music, this one particular Sunday, we introduced a gospel song to the congregation. And so later after worship, one of the ladies came to me and she said, I don't like that jungle rock music that you did. Immediately I was caught off guard, and I actually had to chuckle because that was just her perception. I had another lady come and say, they wanted us to sing a particular song, and I was trying to explain her, tell me what song that is you want me to sing. And she said, one of them songs that you colored sing. These are just a couple of experiences that I've had, in serving white churches, because like Shaun, we bring our culture with us. And when that's not the majority culture, it's a culture that you're unfamiliar with, then it's easy to be othered in those settings. So that's a couple of incidents that I've experienced.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I know so many of us know people who have experienced very overt racism. I would suggest, growing up in Chicago, I have experienced walking down the street and someone hollers out of a passing car window, calling me the N-word. So that has happened. But here in the North Country, it's interesting. I haven't experienced the overt kind of, especially, racialized violence. I have not. But I have been, it's interesting, when I first got here, just a very conversation, very kind person, just saying, another colored woman I met, so and so and so and so, and I was so shaken. But I had been told that I may hear the term colored, and it's been a long time since I've heard it again. But I know that that was just it's a part of the kind of the historical base in this place, but I haven't heard it as much. But it was said there was no aggression, but it was said as just, as one's reality. Yep. That I was colored, not Negro, not African American, not Black, but to this person, but said it just, but not as not in a way that the person he ever thought was insulting. And so I began to kind of understand some of the places, some of the ways in which I may be defined and looked upon. But I grew up with the kind of stories of, my father and on my dad's side, he's they were sharecroppers. And so that's its own history out of slavery, and finding out about the, what my father's family endured as sharecroppers in the Deep South. So that's where I heard about the overt racism and racialized violence. And so those stories, you carry them, Yeah, so I won't go into a lot of, but that broader history, I know Marsha can say something about it. It is definitely there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
But my own personal, not as much.
Yeah. Now you mentioned just that small language that woman used. So I'm going to see if that can feed us into the conversation about microaggressions. Mm-hmm. Now, people might not know what microaggressions are, but a microaggression is just a small thing that kind of like pricks you in just the wrong way. I don't know, Dr. Williams, you might have a better way to explain it, but I'm going to give an example that came from our clergy webinar that we did with the New York conference. And so the person who was leading the webinar said that there was someone who's a pastor. His name, he's a Reverend Doctor. I won't say his name, but let's say Reverend Dr. George Smith, not his name. But so Reverend Dr. George Smith, who is African American, and he was preaching at a church, and he has his doctorate, as the two of you do, but so obviously he's a very intelligent man, all of those years of education that are required. I mean, I know I don't think I'll ever get a doctorate, so God bless you. But all those years of education, clearly this man is highly educated. And he was speaking at a church, and afterwards someone said, "Oh, well, you speak very articulately." Mm-hmm. And just that way of saying that, it's like, they were saying, even though you're a person of color, mm-hmm. you're articulate. Mm-hmm. And that I thought was such a good example of a microaggression. Mm-hmm. Dr. Williams, you have a lot of experience teaching this. Could you say more about microaggressions?
I call it death by 1,000 cuts, where it's simply those everyday little, oftentimes unintentional, little stupid, offensive remarks or comments or actions that white people direct at people of color that they wouldn't direct to a white person. So it's those everyday little things that show and demonstrate the implicit bias that white folks have. Things like you're really pretty for a dark girl, mm-hmm. or the infamous thing, Shaun, can I touch your hair?
Oh,
would you are those things that you would say to a white person? It's just those everyday little jabs and little cuts. For years we've had to endure Aunt Jemima on the syrup bottle for over 100 years. And for some folks, that's their perception of what it means to be a person of color or to be a Black person. So yeah, death by 1,000 cuts. That's how I define it.
And there's something that, in my understanding, a lot of the times people just smile through. Mm-hmm. And so the other people don't witness what you just said really hurt me, because instead you just smile through. And I think all female pastors know a little bit about this. Yeah. That, oh, you're the pastor, yes. And all of those comments, mm-hmm. But it's not the same thing because I can walk out of the church and just go to being Mrs. Duffy.
Right.
And nobody would say a single thing about me. Whereas as a person of color, you have these with you all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think my hope is that all of us who are listening can understand what microaggressions are and can hopefully be more conscious about the words that we say. So as I mentioned earlier, my goal is for us to listen to learn and not to listen to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. And if you have any other examples, I think examples of microaggressions, even throughout this whole conversation, please just chime in and give them.
One of the things I will say in terms of microaggressions that I actually see in academia, sometimes with students of color, the kind of surprise of that, said student is there, kind of how did you get here? Or you must be on scholarship. And, maybe the person is, but the assumption is that you could not have made it on your own.
On your own, right.
And so that is, kind of ubiquitous, that sense. I do kind of, and have talked to a number of students of color, or kind of cross race and culture, who experience those things of persons wondering how that they make it into this space.
Because there's some sort of an expectation that you cannot achieve this on your own merit. So you shouldn't be here. Or the only way that you arrived here is that someone had to give you that, give up their space so that you could have that space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. And I'll tell you, all of my friends who I went to seminary with and college with, who were people of color, were brilliant and fully 100% deserve to be there. So I hope that anybody who might have those thoughts in their head, oh, there's a person of color and they're here. Are they here because they filled a quota? I hope that we can erase those thoughts from our minds. I mean, I will tell you, in seminary, I don't know, maybe Black pastors are just naturally brilliant, or with all of my friends who are there, I can't tell you the most brilliant minds I've ever been in conversation with. I think were my friends who are people of color in seminary. So I really hope that we can just do our best to, if those thoughts come in, because they happen sometimes. I think sometimes these racist thoughts do enter our minds. They're here because of X, Y, or Z.
The stereotype.
And we need to, I think, do our best to just get them out. Get behind me, Satan, with those thoughts.
That takes the work. That's work.
It is, but thank you for sharing that, Dr. Whitehead. So going along with this, I think that most people, I'm going to say everybody, we've got like 47 people with us right now. I think all of us can clearly say, or hopefully say, we're not racist. But there's a difference between being not racist and anti-racist. Would either of you like to address that?
Marsha?
Well, I'm actually reading a book right now by Ibram Kendi, and the book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in this book, this author's premise, with which I actually agree, is that being anti-racist is more than just ridding oneself of racist attitudes and beliefs and behaviors, but that it requires a different kind of mindset, one that chooses to become actively involved in dismantling the very systems from which you actually benefit from. So being an anti-racist is standing up and calling out, not only calling out racist acts, ideals, and policies wherever you encounter them, whether it's in the boardroom or if it's in your living room. So it's about being intentional about stepping aside and promoting the voices of people of color. And then working alongside them to daily, on a regular, consistently, to topple the structures that keep folks marginalized. So anti-racist is taking that active participatory role in dismantling the racist structures that exist in our society.
And Ibram would also talk about, I'm reading a little bit of him, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Sam from the beginning,
Yeah.
and some of his other things. But it requires another level of risk.
Yes.
To to fight against systems that you may benefit from, and so that's much harder. That's deeper, and one of the things that he and so many other scholars have been talking about, is that often we even think of racism as behaviors only. So, right. And if you can kind of, if you can muddle it down to just somebody's behaviors, then you can point and say, see, that's just that bad person over there. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I'm not like that. And, but racism itself is much deeper than that.
I like how you pointed us towards the discussion of systemic racism. And I don't think you did that intentionally, yet you did, so thank you. So let's talk about systemic racism. Systemic racism, and I have a link that I'm going to share here. Systemic racism is just the way that our systems in place in this country, I don't know if I say encourage racism, but keep people of color usually pushed down a little bit. I'm not good at explaining this. Dr. Williams, you might want to chime in. Do you want to explain it better than I just attempted to?
It's like what Shaun was saying. It's not these individual acts by individuals, but systemic racism is about these intersecting, overlapping racist institutions, policies, practices, ideals that are deeply woven into the fabric of this country, in such a way that it ensures the resources, the rights, and the power remain in the wheelhouse of the privileged majority, while denying those same resources, rights, and powers to people of color. So it's not just that guy, it's the system that's been created to keep that guy in the privileged position that he's in.
And we see systemic racism at play in our educational systems.
Absolutely.
Right? We see it at play in where we live. I grew up not knowing what redlining was, not understanding why I live where I live, not understanding the segregation, the deep segregation that is still quite prevalent in Chicago, but beyond Chicago, that in terms of redlining, people, there are people, especially with, people who are in higher tax brackets or get more resources in certain communities, and so the redlining, allowed for, our white siblings to live in places that receive better resources, and people of color, Black and brown folk who are in places that do not receive that level of resources. Yeah, and definitely in the school system as well.
Absolutely.
Now I'll tell you that somebody mentioned to me, one of my church members, when his family was moving out of Buffalo, so this is in his lifetime, they chose not to buy one house because the house still had the restriction that whoever bought it could not sell it to a person of color. And so his family was quite progressive for that time to say, no, this is not something that we want to participate in. Yeah. But I guarantee you, somebody bought that house and signed the agreement that they would not sell to a person of color. And that house was in what's now Williamsville, which has one of the best school systems in the state, which is why I happen to live in Williamsville, because I wanted that school system. But I never had anybody say, you can't live here because, but I love how, again, you mentioned education. So systemic racism is fully a part of our educational system. Yes, the houses that we live in, many houses had those restrictions where you could not sell to a person of color. And it's shocking, but until very recently, there were a lot of people who had those agreements in their contracts. Sure. Yeah. But I was really taken aback this past summer when my youth group and myself went to Philadelphia, and we went on our mission trip to be with one of my friend's churches, Reverend Shaun James. And when we were working down there, we found out that so many children in the city of Philadelphia and West Philadelphia, where we were, are far under the literacy level. And so I just did a quick little search, and 17% of children in Philadelphia, only 17, are at or above reading level at the 4th grade. And most of these children are people of color. And so we did some education while we were down there where we got to learn. And we found out that the reason why is because years ago, they decided to strip away some funding from Philadelphia schools. They removed all of the libraries. Any of the libraries that are there are in by a nonprofit. They're sponsored by a nonprofit. They're not required. And this still is part of systemic racism, where we're saying we're not going to fund our school systems that mostly have children of color. And because we're not funding those school systems the same way that we're funding our primarily white school systems, the children then end up falling behind.
Absolutely.
And that to me is so dangerous. And I was continuing to look, and I found out that 75% of inmates in prison, which we know sadly are primarily people of color, are not at a high school reading level. So there's all those connections, and that's how systemic racism works.
Yep.
We're not going to give you the same basis of education. And Dr. Whitehead and I were talking about this yesterday, about how when you graduate high school, if you're not at an even playing field, if you don't know how to read at a 12th grade level, you're not getting the same opportunities.
Right.
And that, in my mind, is one of the most dangerous things too about systemic racism.
And is this because, Black and brown people are inferior? No. Right? It is because, the opportunities have been severely limited.
Absolutely. And I want to jump into some of these questions. I, of course, want to tackle more that we have, but we have some questions that have come in. So I thought, take a little intermission and engage in some of these questions. Now, let me just make sure I'm not missing anybody at the top. But it looks like one of these questions from Glenn Gordon is, this is interesting. He says, as a white person, I feel we have a collective guilt for racism. How can we move beyond this? It's an interesting question.
I don't know that I have the real answer to this, but I can say it is so interesting to me, the ways in which proper history, the true history of this nation, is not taught in our schools. And so there is, it's so hard for us to, we recognize that we need healing around race and racial issues, but the bottom line is that healing can't happen if we won't face the truth, if we won't face who we have been, who we are as a nation. Why do we think this way about the peoples of the nation and world? Where does that come from? And if all we know about Black people is that, African Americans, just, domestic Black African Americans were in slavery, and then maybe people may know about Jim Crow, or maybe they don't. Maybe, some people skip right onto the civil rights movement, right? And they only know of Dr. Martin Luther King, and then here we are. Remember, you all, elected Barack Obama, so everything should be, dandy, right? And it's so interesting when I realize the ways in which we do not know about Reconstruction. We don't know about the great, the compromise. So what, that, and I believe so much of our history is lingering with us today. And so this is, I think that the healing of, what Jim Wallace and others would call this nation's original sin,
right.
It can come when we face who we have been, how we got here. And you and I were talking yesterday, Elizabeth, about one of the things that I believe is we always say that we are all created in the imago Dei, right? We are created in the image of God, the image of the divine. And I think the greatest insult is when that we, because of racism, racial hatred, prejudice, discrimination, all these things. I believe that what we're basically saying to God is, it's the greatest insult. We're saying, God, you have made a mistake. So to somehow denigrate folk because of how they come to the universe. Ultimately, I think that's our reckoning. I think we have to reckon with God, because and the many ways that we have kept folk down because of because of the color of our skin and those many things. And I kind of come on back to the imago Dei, they're created in the image of God. And so I look at God's creation and I am blown away by the many different ways that we come. But since the founding of this nation, we have not believed in the beauty, the richness, the wonder of our divine creator.
And Shaun, I think white people also need to wrestle with that guilt.
Yes.
And utilize it to educate themselves.
Face it.
Face it, own it, and get to the place where you can be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And then
Absolutely.
use that guilt to do better, to improve your situation and improve the situation. So I think they have to wrestle with that guilt a little bit.
Absolutely.
We had a vigil at SLU a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about how we have to lean into our discomfort.
That's it.
All of us do, and it's interesting. And I was very clear saying, the thing is, a lot of people think that I'm just saying white people have to lean into their discomfort. There are some, I'm not going to talk about anybody else. Let me say that as an African-American woman in a predominantly white institution, folk don't know the wrestling I have to do to lean into this discomfort of speaking about race publicly as a leader, primarily because I know I'll be misunderstood a lot, right? And because I misunderstand, and because I too am still learning, because the ways in which one articulates what we are dealing with, especially in this day and age about race and racism.
Yeah.
I want you to know that Glenn just gave you an amen. And you don't know Glenn, he has the loudest amen. And I say that in
I like Glenn already.
Glenn.
Meeting Glenn,
Yeah. You'll love him if you ever meet him. Now, I find it interesting, you guys were saying that we need to be uncomfortable. I was doing my own reflection, going back to when I first started having these conversations with people. And I said at first, it made me feel uncomfortable. That's the exact word that I used. It just made me feel uncomfortable. I would start to get a little defensive, saying, but I'm not racist. Mm-hmm. And it's hard because here I was like, but I'm not racist. And so I feel uncomfortable talking about this. Mm-hmm. I'm also the kind of person that does not like conflict. So if there's a conflict that can't be easily resolved, which this is one of those, it made me feel even more comfortable. But that's where I said, but I learned to listen, just to listen so I could learn. And then, of course, I also started doing more things, realizing that school budgets need to be passed. So even before I had children, making sure to vote in those.
Right.
But also recently looking into literacy programs. And so it makes us kind of open our eyes a little bit. And I'll say that the discomfort doesn't last long. So if we're willing to get uncomfortable, it doesn't stay. Mm-hmm. So if we allow ourselves as white people to be uncomfortable. What did you say, Dr. Whitehead?
Even with that discomfort, some of us have to get out of our own way, especially with lives lost on out in the streets.
Yeah.
It's like, let me say, I can think of when I was maybe a victim of respectability, not wanting to really, rock the boat too much because, I don't want folk to misunderstand. But at the same time, folk who look just like me and like my father, and, nephews and, and nieces, the bottom line is too much is on the line for my silence. I think, was it Audre Lorde who said your silence will not protect you?
Right.
And we're finding that. I think that it is important that we just step on out into the discomfort, and acknowledge and know as we step out into it. I was so glad that Dr. Marsha was going to be on this call tonight, because I knew that I could just be up under her wing. You know what I mean? Because I don't see myself as one who is an expert, but but as one who is as well learning to articulate these issues that are so very critical for the liberation of all people, for human flourishing to really happen. We have to face what is before us. This elephant that is in the room has been growing and getting more dangerous amongst us in this world. So
I think we have to we count our risk. I know I don't even think about the risk anymore. It just, I don't really care what people think as it relates to this. And I'm not here trying to win a popularity poll. I'm here trying to liberate my people, and do what needs to be done. But I will say this is one of the challenges that I have with so-called progressive Christians, because these are the folks who somehow believe that because of their faith, they somehow have arrived as it relates often to the work of dismantling racism. And it's this so-called arrival somehow affords them the privilege of becoming comfortable and somewhat apathetic when it comes to dealing with race issues. And they can, gloss past it. And so their mindset is like what you were saying, Elizabeth, I'm not racist. Or since it's not me that's engaging in that behavior, then somehow they think, that the real work for them is done. But this mindset isn't really helpful to the fight, because I'm reminded of the words of Dr. King, when Dr. King said, in the end, we remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends.
Amen.
So if you believe that we're living in a post-racial society, then you simply stop paying attention. And this inattentiveness hurts the progress of actually fighting racism as a structure.
Absolutely. Now I want to say, read this comment that I just read here on our Facebook page from Danny Henneman. And it says, I think most white people are never the only one in the room. We do not need to put ourselves into those uncomfortable places so we can understand, or we do need to put ourselves in those uncomfortable places so that we can understand a little bit better.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that, Danny. I also want to just mention, I had put a link on the comment section to a Vox video about how Southern socialists, I don't remember the full, rewrote the Civil War history. And I believe on with us is a professor at the University of Buffalo on the Civil War. And I had asked her about it. She was in agreement. But I found it so very interesting how the Daughters of the Confederate, it's a short video, easy to watch, but how they actually had textbooks rewritten.
Yeah.
So that they would explain the Civil War differently. Yeah. And how those textbooks stayed in place until the 1970s, and how this is how there ended up being even more emphasis on really the being like, it's okay to be racist. That's what I got from the video, that you had these groups that from the time they were children, they were just being indoctrinated. And so all that continued until at least the 1970s. And yes, that's the South. And I think for us Northerners, it's easy to be like, it's the South's fault and it's the South's problem. But I like that hopefully we can engage in the uncomfortable nature of these discussions. That's the only way we're all going to learn and grow.
But why would you rewrite the history books if you have no concern about how you're going to be depicted in history? If you think that what you're doing is the right thing, why rewrite the history books? Why tell a lie when the truth will do? And and so just tell the story if this is what you think is the right thing to do. So the fact that you're rewriting history says something bothers you about the way that history is unfolded.
Yeah. It's a scary thing, and it's scary what a strong effect it has.
Yeah.
And I think about that as there's a house down the road from me. I have a semi-diverse neighborhood for being in Amherst, New York. And there's a house right down the road with a Confederate flag flying outside. Many of us have attempted to see if we can have it removed. He has cameras. I know I'm married to an attorney, so that's a good thing. If I do get arrested,
you got some help.
But that all feeds into this. How it's like an ignorance and not wanting to admit that there's anything wrong with the whole white power idea. And that's how this idea of supremacy happens. And it's scary and it's dangerous. And my hope is that those of us who are white can see how dangerous it is and hope to change it. As you said, Dr. Williams, not just be uncomfortable, but also work to change. Okay. What Danny also said, every lie I unlearn, I learn something new.
Wow. That's good.
So there's some other comments that I will grab in just a moment, but let's think about some of the other things that we wanted to talk about. Give me just a moment. So I wanted to talk about the phrase Black Lives Matter. So I don't know how I missed it. I think it's because I jumped down to microaggressions, so I missed it. This was actually my number 2 topic that I wanted to bring up. I think that people are slowly starting to understand the phrase Black Lives Matter more than they have in the last couple of years. Marsha, you're like, I don't know. In my Facebook feed, at least, I'm seeing some progress. But how do we best explain what the phrase Black Lives Matter means? And there's the forest example that, if one rainforest is in danger, you don't go shouting, all forest matters, because right now we need to help the rainforest. I actually liked an example that one of my friends gave, and she said that if you're at a funeral dealing with your own grief over a loved one, it would be like somebody else coming into the funeral and saying, well, my grief matters too. It's like, we know your grief matters too, but right now we're dealing with this grief specifically.
This acute moment here, yeah.
Yeah. So would you like to speak to the phrase at all? Or how you feel when somebody comments? Because there's people who I swear it's their mission just to find Facebook posts that say Black Lives Matters so that they can say
all lives matter.
All lives matter.
Yeah.
Or do you want to comment either on that, the first phrase, or how you feel when somebody says all lives matter?
I'll say this. Oh, for the day when all lives matter.
Yeah.
Oh, for the day. Bring it on. And that's often, that's the swift rebuttal, isn't it? It's a deflection. It is so that we do not center Black lives. And the thing is, and this is not about saying only Black lives matter and other lives don't, but it is about, these are the folk in peril, and here's the thing, you will see now that acronym, I don't know how to say it properly, but it's BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So even when we say Black Lives Matter, it is not, we are not necessarily, we are not articulating that and nobody else's life matters, but we are saying at this time, and this came especially when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and then there were subsequent killings and murder of Black folk, and the things, especially with law enforcement, sometimes there's not the presumption of innocence. We're asking, where's the de-escalation when it comes to Black lives, when you're dealing with folk who are unarmed on the street, or people who may have participated in, maybe it's petty criminal activity, maybe it's not petty criminal activity. The thing is, apprehend. I mean, just the number, the ways in which so many people were losing their lives caused those three Black women those years ago to create the hashtag, hence the human rights movement, Black Lives Matter, having to, reminding and trying a plea out to the universe that, these lives have value for folk who may have never known, may have never even thought about. And if there's a sense that, Black folk are inferior, then, this notion of superiority and inferiority, this was to topple all of that. And so all lives don't matter yet. May we get there.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
I think I totally agree with Shaun, but I think sometimes it's having this mindset, these degrees of oppression. So we're going to have, the hierarchy of pain, or what have you. But this goes back, for me, it goes back to that feeling of exhaustion that I mentioned earlier. It's the exhaustion of continually having to explain this to white people. The ones who simply choose to step over the obvious in order to shift the narrative to something that allows them to be in the victim chair. And so, yes, all lives matter, but we're not seeing all lives being shot and strangled in the streets. What we are seeing are Black and brown bodies, our Black sons and daughters. So all lives can't matter until those lives matter.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, it's just a way to shift the narrative so that we don't have to deal with what's actually happening right in front of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And, with Marsha saying that, but it's like the globe is standing up now. Right. Something, thank goodness for technology. But the thing is, even with technology, even watching something in real time and all that kind of stuff, you will still have folk who say, but, and sometimes when the buts come, it's maddening. It's painful. The trauma intensifies because why doesn't this Black pain move some folk? That's a hard thing. Why aren't you in agony at watching something happen to this
to another human being?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, my mother, who is a pastor, always is on me anytime I say but. Because when you say but, you are erasing everything else that's been said. And so when people start coming in and responding with all lives matter, it's like they're almost saying, but, all lives matter. So it's erasing that whole Black Lives Matter movement and the message that people are trying to get across. That always makes me think of that. And one thing that I also want us to think of, you've mentioned the police killings, but also one thing that I like to think about is those videos. There was just the one person, Christian, I can't remember his last name, but he was bird watching, and he asked the woman to put her dog on a leash, and this man there was not a threatening thing about him, and she called the police on him. And there's so many of these examples of people who are white calling the police on people of color. And so often I think it's easy for us just to blame the police without even saying we're also the ones calling the police on people of color at an extremely high rate. There's been so many videos. People go into their own apartments, and it's a nice apartment building, and somebody doesn't believe that they live there.
Right.
Their own homes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's something that I hope that we can, all of us who are watching, we might not be in that situation of being out on the street, but we might be the person who, for one reason or another, feels threatened, sadly, just because of the color of a person's skin.
Yeah.
And maybe we want to pick up the phone and call the police on that person without realizing what we might be doing.
Yeah,
and so
my
hope
killed.
is that we can realize what we're doing and not do it. But also, Dr. Williams, you had mentioned about the exhaustion. Now, I've been trying to listen to a lot of my friends who are pastors and people of color, and I can tell that many of you are getting exhausted about having to explain this to the rest of us over and over and over again. And yet, I'm sorry that you have to continue to do this because we're being kind of slow at waking up. But I also want to thank you for pushing through that exhaustion, but to honor that exhaustion of how tough it must be when you're like, why do I have to explain this to again? What are your thoughts on the exhaustion? Do you have any more of those?
I think for me, it's pushing through, because I know that, there's generations yet unborn who shouldn't have to deal with this. I'm dealing with it. My grandmother dealt with it. I'm sure that, there were people who marched so that I could be sitting right here having this conversation. And so I look at it from the perspective of if I can continue to do my part, then maybe it will make some headway for my grandchildren. Where I can look at my grandmother and those folks who marched just so I could have the right to vote. I'd be foolish now not to utilize that right to vote. So if my efforts now can make a difference for generations yet unborn, then you keep pressing through.
Amen. Well, we're at close to an hour, I think, because of my technical difficulties. I lost track of time. So thank God that it eventually worked, and thank you all for being patient with me. But what else would you like to share? Dr. Williams, I know you work on a program within the conference. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but I also want to bring up this issue that came out. I was talking to a pastor the other day, and the issue about the violence that erupted in many of our cities. With these past couple of weeks and whatnot. And, Dr. Martin Luther King said that the violence is the voice of the unheard. And so I think that what we're looking at here is the anger and the frustration of young Black people continuing to say that this exists and that we're dying. And it appears that no one is listening. As you were saying, listening to understand, nothing really changes. But what I said to this minister, when I was speaking with, I raised the question. I said, for me, the bigger question is, why is it that when little white boys burn down a city over a sporting event, that they're called revelers? But when Black folks get involved, it's now a riot. I think that's a question that some white folks need to pause for a moment and answer. Why are they more concerned about Macy's than they are about a human being's life being snuffed out? That is something I think that white people need to wrestle with.
Absolutely. And the way that we say it immediately, and even thinking about beforehand, I don't support kneeling, think of a different way to protest. Okay, so now they're out in the streets protesting. Yeah. Okay, that's good as long as it stays peaceful. But then you have those few, and it's not a lot, the few that riot in some way, and suddenly it's now I can't support this.
And a lot of them were white folks.
If you watch
the video, there was a lot of white folks.
Yep.
With the big screen TVs and so forth. And I will say the Black people did walk off with the Jordans. I did see that. They took on the sneakers. But the point is, why is there different perceptions of the same kind of behavior?
Oh yeah. Vancouver, I know, after one of their big sporting championships, completely destroyed. I remember I think it was after the Red Sox finally won the World Series, when I was at St. Lawrence with you, Dr. Whitehead. And I remember seeing a video of somebody just driving over people. And so this is what happens when everybody's out and they start getting intoxicated, and they're doing all of this in these white sporting events, and it's deemed okay in some way. And yet we demonize people when a protest turns into a riot.
And I think some of it some of it is a holdover or a carryover from the historical lens, right? When we take into account the humanity of Black people, people who see Black people as subhuman.
Yes.
Kind of absolutely, and we have to really kind of look at, do we believe that we are all created in the image of God? I guess we need to finally just ask ourselves that question: Do we believe?
Mm-hmm.
Do we believe that? You know what I mean? And do we, especially when I think about people of faith, when I think of Christians, does this gospel really matter to us? Does what Jesus called us to do really matter to us? Who we are to love God, our neighbors and ourselves, you know what I mean? And who is our neighbor? The ways in which we pick and choose, it's maddening.
Yeah.
And so,
but some of us have the privilege of picking and choosing. Everybody doesn't.
And it's, and the thing is, and we dishonor God, I believe. I believe that it is one of the greatest insults to the one who has created us.
Amen.
When we say to the omnipotent, omniscient one of the universe, you erred. I believe that that's what ultimately we are saying.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And hopefully, I'm so thrilled that people are watching. Hopefully, our people are watching and learning and listening and growing. And that's our goal at this point. And hopefully to make change. Now, I will tell you that one member of our church, shortly after my brother died 6 months ago, said, I want to see something good happen knowing that you're so heartbroken. So she made a large donation to the NAACP.
Oh,
and I said, you know my heart. And it made me cry happy tears for once. But thinking about what we can do, because I'm a problem solver. So I always want to know, okay, I can sit here, I can work through my discomfort, but I also want to be part of the change. I want to do things that I can, find out ways that I can help. And so I started thinking, and you guys can help add to my list. What are some ways that we can help? Number one, and this came up at our past clergy Zoom the other day, we can give financially to programs that are out there doing the hard work. We can't be out there always doing everything. Plus, I think as white people, we need to be there to support, but we also can't overshadow people of color who are leading the protest or anything that they're doing.
Well, Elizabeth, here in the New York conference, we have the New and Right Spirit anti-racism program, and it is our movement within the New York conference to address issues of racism within our churches and within our communities. And so folks are more than welcome to give to the New and Right Spirit program on the UCC New York website. There's a donate button, and you go there and click New and Right Spirit and make your donation. We would be happy to receive that and to continue the work that we're doing with New and Right Spirit.
Exactly. Wonderful. And we can get our churches involved in the New and Right Spirit.
Right. We have we created something called the Racial Diversity Assessment. And this is for congregations to take an assessment, ask you some very pointed questions about your building, about your worship, about your governance, your spiritual formation within your church. But it helps congregations identify where whiteness is centered in their life as a church, and how that could be a hindrance to this welcoming environment that they're seeking to create. And so when you your church takes the assessment as a whole, your leadership, your pastor work through the assessment, you receive a score. And then it comes back to us, and then we will help you with what we call a diversified document that gives you a series of ways of different areas of how you can begin to diversify your church experience in your life as a faith community.
Wonderful. And I know Dr. King, I think, was the one who said that Sunday mornings are the most segregated day of the week.
Yeah.
And it's still tough.
Yes.
I marvel when I see truly multicultural churches.
But they have issues as well in trying to stay multicultural.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I thank you so much. I thank you for your words, for your grace, for your taking the time to educate all of us. I just truly thank you. Are there any other words you want to add before we go?
It's just an honor to be here tonight. I want to thank you, and I'm grateful to be here with Dr. Marsha. So, and Reverend Elizabeth, I can't wait to come to your church.
Yeah, well, I saw some comments. Can any of these ladies come to the church?
Yes. You know, when COVID-19, we continue to pray for those who have been affected deeply by that, but it has, of course, affected our nation and globe. But when this is lifted in whatever way that's going to look like, I look forward to.
We're heading up your way.
Yes, indeed.
We're going to take a road trip.
Well, Shaun's headed down.
Yes,
I'm headed up.
And the only thing that I want to just bring up is the song that has been in my head. And if I was Shaun, I could sing, but I can't. Maybe you know it and maybe you can sing it. But it's that song, I Need You to Survive. I won't harm you with words of my mouth. I love you. I need you to survive.
Yes, indeed.
And as I was thinking about us having this conversation, that is what I'm thinking for all of our brothers and sisters. And all of our brothers and sisters of color. And when I see the phrase Black Lives Matter, and when I say that phrase, that's what I mean. You know, I love you and I need you to survive.
Yes.
Amen.
And that I won't harm you with words from my mouth. And that's such, I don't know where that song came from.
Hezekiah Walker.
Oh yeah, I love it though.
Yeah.
All right. Well, God bless you both.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I pray that your ministries are blessed. We all have very different ministries, and I thank you, and I just pray for you, and I pray for our world.
Amen.
Yes, indeed. And God bless your congregation.
Indeed.
Thank you. Yes, I know they're appreciating it. Many of them are chimed in right now, and they're appreciating all of your words.
Well, tell them I can't wait to see them soon.
Well, they hear you.
Okay. Good deal.
All right. God bless you both.
Right. Good to see you, Shaun.
And God love you. And thank you again for your patience.
All right. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.